Good evening. Tonight's tale isn't about the mighty gods or the renowned heroes. It's about those who lived beneath their shadows, the mortals, those who prayed for mercy, dodged divine tempers, and tried to survive in a world where falling in love or planting the wrong crop could earn you a lifetime of suffering or a transformation into a shrub. If this kind of storytelling helps you relax, feel free to like and subscribe, but only if it genuinely brings you peace. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. There's something quietly magical about drifting off together even across time zones. So close your eyes, let your breathing slow, and let's begin with why it truly sucked to be a mortal in Greek mythology. Let us begin not with thunder or prophecy but with a girl and her loom. She was called Arachne, a mortal with hands so skilled they moved like wind through wool. Her tapestries shimmered with color and precision, scenes so finely woven they seemed to breathe. People said she must have learned from Athena herself, which was the sort of praise one should never utter too loudly in ancient Greece. Arachne didn't deny it. In fact, she laughed. She said she was better. And that, you see, was a mistake. For the gods of Olympus were not distant, noble deities. They were near, always near, and they didn't particularly like being compared to mortals, let alone outdone by them. So Athena came down from the heavens, her pride pricked like a burr under the skin, and challenged the girl to a contest. 2 looms, 2 minds, 1 divine, 1 human. And Arachne's tapestry, it was exquisite, a panorama of the gods' misdeeds. Zeus seducing women in a dozen disguises, Poseidon ravishing Medusa in Athena's temple, Apollo chasing nymphs who wanted nothing to do with him. The thread glittered with uncomfortable truth. Athena's work, by contrast, was flawless and stern, a depiction of piety and punishment. But when she saw Arachne's piece, she flew into a rage, not because it was wrong but because it wasn't. She tore it apart and struck the girl down. Then, in that strangely poetic cruelty the gods so loved, transformed her into a spider. And so Arachne still weaves, but without fingers, without pride, without a voice, a cautionary tale, and one that sets the tone. Because in Greek mythology, if a god notices you, it rarely ends well. The Olympians, you see, were not above meddling. They did not dwell on high with benevolent detachment. They peered down, eyes sharp as hawks, looking for beauty, arrogance, wit, or defiance, anything that might amuse or annoy them. Humans were their toys, their distractions, their cautionary examples. Take Semele, a mortal woman beloved of Zeus. He whispered sweet nothings into her ear and promised her anything she wished. And in a moment of fatal honesty she asked to see him as he truly was, in all his divine radiance. Zeus warned her, begged her to reconsider, but an oath was an oath. And when he revealed his true form, the brightness alone consumed her, burned her to ash. Their unborn child Dionysus was saved only because Zeus sewed him into his own thigh like a strange botanical graft. He was born later with a head full of vines and madness. Another mortal, Io, suffered a different fate. She caught Zeus's eye, an unfortunate habit of many young women in mythology. To conceal her from Hera, Zeus turned her into a cow, a lovely cow to be fair, but still a cow. Hera, never wanting to be fooled for long, demanded the cow as a gift and assigned Argus, a giant with 100 eyes, to guard her. And so Io wandered, watched always, pursued by a gadfly sent to torment her. She crossed continents, became a legend. Eventually, she was restored to human form, but not before learning that divine attention was a form of punishment in itself. Even mortals who never sought glory often found themselves dragged into the gods' schemes. Cassandra was one such soul. She was given the gift of prophecy by Apollo in exchange for her love. But when she changed her mind, as people do, Apollo did not take rejection well. He cursed her. She would still speak true prophecies, but no one would ever believe her. She saw the fall of Troy, she saw her own death, she saw fire and ruin, and no one listened, not once. The Greeks had a word for this kind of tragic arrogance, hubris. It wasn't just pride, it was overstepping, crossing invisible lines drawn by gods who did not like their creations to become too clever, too bold, or too beautiful. Mortals who rose too high were always brought low, not always with death but sometimes with something worse. Take Niobe, queen of Thebes. She had many children, 12 in some stories, 14 in others, and she made the mistake of bragging that she was more deserving of worship than Leto, who had only 2. Unfortunately for Niobe, Leto's 2 children were Artemis and Apollo. They descended like arrows from the sky, and one by one Niobe's children fell. She wept, screamed, and begged. In the end the gods turned her to stone, a weeping rock carved by grief, and somewhere in Anatolia the stone still stands. Mortals could rarely win, and when they did it often came with strings attached. Like poor Phaethon, who demanded proof that the sun god Helios was his father. Helios, bound by paternal pride and perhaps a touch of guilt, allowed him to drive the chariot of the sun for a day. a teenage boy at the reins of a flaming sky-burning day-dragging chariot. It did not go well, he lost control. The sun veered too close to the earth. Fields scorched, rivers boiled, the world began to unravel. Zeus, ever the cosmic janitor, hurled a lightning bolt and ended it. Phaethon fell like a star and crashed into the river Eridanus. Mortals grieved, the gods moved on. Even the great wars of mortals were often started by divine pettiness. The Trojan War, for instance, did not begin with ships or sieges. It began with a golden apple. The Rif's goddess of discord wasn't invited to a divine wedding, so she did what any resentful guest might. She tossed a golden apple into the feast inscribed with the words, "To the fairest." Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite all reached for it. They demanded a judge, and they found one in Paris. A Trojan prince tending sheep far from the noise of court. Each goddess offered him a gift. Hera offered power, Athena offered wisdom and victory in battle, Aphrodite offered the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. He chose beauty, he chose Aphrodite, and that woman, Helen, was already married to a Spartan king. When Paris took her to Troy, the world ignited. 1,000 ships launched, heroes died, cities burned, all because one mortal was asked to judge a divine beauty pageant. It should be said, no good ever came of mortals trying to decide which god was better. The gods didn't want truth, they wanted flattery. But mortals could not avoid them, not really. They prayed, they sacrificed, they lit fires and poured wine and whispered names before sleep. The temples were many and the gods were everywhere, not always listening but always present. And the relationship was not about love, it was about survival. To be a mortal was to walk carefully, to give thanks quickly, to take no credit even for your own genius, to hope above all to be overlooked, because to be noticed by the gods was to become a story. And in Greek mythology, stories rarely ended well. The gods did not weep for mortals, they used them. Sometimes they gave gifts, yes, a golden touch here, a prophecy there. But the gifts often turned sour. Midas wished for everything he touched to turn to gold, and soon he could touch nothing, not bread, not water, not his daughter. He begged for the gift to be taken back. It was, but not before he learned that divine generosity always has a price. Some mortals tried to outwit fate, but fate was older than the gods. The Moirai, the fates, spun, measured, and cut the threads of life. Even Zeus could not undo what they wove. Oedipus tried. Told he would kill his father and marry his mother, he fled the home he knew, and in doing so, he fulfilled the prophecy. The very effort to escape his doom brought it into being. That was the cruel beauty of Greek myth. No one was above fate, not kings, not queens, not heroes, and certainly not mortals. So why, one might wonder, did people keep believing in these gods? Why pray to deities who punished more than protected? Because the gods explained the world, the storms, the floods, the sudden illnesses, the way fortunes rose and fell. All of it could be seen in the stories. The gods gave shape to chaos, they made meaning from suffering. They were not just punishers, they were metaphors, archetypes, warnings in flesh. And for all their flaws, they were unforgettable. To be a mortal in Greek mythology was to be temporary. A momentary flash of joy or error, a name in a line of verse, a thread in the great tapestry of fate, sometimes brilliant, often blood-stained, always fragile. And somewhere above or beyond the gods watched, amused, displeased, or merely curious. And you, little mortal, you simply did your best to survive the story. It's one thing to make a mistake and suffer for it, but imagine being doomed not because of what you did, but because of what your great-great-grandfather once said to a god. Possibly while drunk and possibly while losing at dice. In the world of Greek mythology, curses were not simply misfortunes, they were legacy items, heirlooms passed down with the family name. You could inherit your father's nose, your mother's eyes, and a divine malediction that would ruin your entire bloodline for generations. It made for a dramatic family tree, heavy on nobility, light on happy endings. Consider, for example, the House of Atreus, a dynasty so steeped in doom that it makes the average soap opera look like a church picnic. The trouble began, as it so often does, with a quarrel between brothers. Atreus and Thyestes, sons of Pelops, squabbled over the Mycenaean throne. There was betrayal, adultery, and then, inevitably, cannibalism. Atreus, having discovered that his brother had an affair with his wife, decided the appropriate response was to serve him a feast of his own children, artfully roasted. Now, you might assume the gods would intervene here. Smite someone, send a memo. But no, the gods simply nodded grimly and let the curse settle in like a stain. From that moment on, the family was doomed. Atreus' son, Agamemnon, went on to become the commander of the Greek forces in the Trojan War. A great honor. He also sacrificed his daughter Iphigenia to get a favorable wind, spent 10 years at war, and was murdered in his bath upon returning home by his wife Clytemnestra and her lover. His surviving children then had to decide whether avenging their father was more important than not murdering their mother, a difficult position even by mythological standards. Orestes the son chose vengeance. He killed Clytemnestra and was promptly hounded across the land by the Furies, ancient goddesses of vengeance with snakes for hair and a passion for justice that did not forgive matricide. Only with divine intervention and a trial at the Areopagus in Athens was Orestes finally acquitted. But even then, the stain lingered. The house of Atreus was the cautionary tale of cautionary tales, a bloodline cursed with betrayal, madness, and murder, not because each generation was evil, but because the weight of divine wrath could not be shaken off like old dust. And it wasn't just royal families who suffered this fate. Take Oedipus, poor unfortunate Oedipus, born to Laius and Jocasta, king and queen of Thebes. Laius, like many mythical men, made a mistake. He abducted a young man, violating hospitality and sacred law. The gods frowned upon this, and a curse was laid. The prophecy came. Their child would kill his father and marry his mother. Naturally, they did what any responsible parents might do. They tried to have the baby killed, but the servant they tasked with the job couldn't quite bring himself to do it. He left the child to die on a hillside instead. A shepherd found him. The boy was raised in Corinth, unaware of his origins. Years later, Oedipus, now a young man, heard a whisper of prophecy himself, that he would kill his father and marry his mother. Horrified, he fled Corinth, trying to outrun destiny. But you can't outpace the fates. He met Laius on the road. There was an argument, as ancient fathers and sons are wont to have. A fight broke out, one man died. Later, Oedipus married Jocasta, queen of Thebes, and had children. The truth came slowly, horribly. Jocasta hanged herself. Oedipus blinded himself. And their children, Antigone and her siblings, would inherit not just a ruined throne, but a family history thick with sorrow. Greek tragedy, you see, doesn't bother with happy endings. It begins with the seed of ruin and watches it grow. This idea that a family line could be cursed wasn't just poetic fiction. The Greeks believed in something called miasma, a kind of spiritual pollution. It could be inherited. You could be born unclean because of the sins of your ancestors. Blood cries out for more blood, and until the cycle is broken through sacrifice, exile, or divine mercy, it continues. We might see it as metaphor today. Generational trauma, the sins of the father. But for the Greeks it was very literal, a spiritual rot that clung to a name, not unlike mildew on stone. You could change your clothes, your city, even your gods, but the curse remained. And so we find mortals who live in fear, not of what they might do, but of what they are, who they are. Perseus, hero and slayer of Medusa, was himself born of questionable circumstance. His mother Danae was locked in a bronze chamber by her father, who had heard a prophecy that her child would kill him. Zeus, never one to let bronze get in the way of romance, visited her in the form of golden rain. One of the stranger seduction tactics in myth, Danae conceived, Perseus was born. The king, Acrisius, did not kill the child, but set mother and son adrift at sea. They survived. Perseus thrived. Years later he returned and, entirely by accident, struck his grandfather dead with a discus at some friendly games. Fate fulfilled even when no one meant any harm. Prophecy finds its loopholes. These stories reflect something deep in the Greek psyche. The idea that fate is not something you can bargain with. It is a web already woven, and every step you take simply tangles you further. Mortals tried to be clever. They tried to outthink destiny. But the gods always smiled quietly and let them try. Sometimes the curse was physical. The line of Cadmus, founder of Thebes, was riddled with misfortune. His descendants included Pentheus, torn apart by his own mother in a frenzy of Dionysian madness, and Actaeon, who accidentally saw Artemis bathing and was transformed into a stag, then hunted and killed by his own hounds. Cadmus himself, after a life of toil and tragedy, was turned into a serpent. His wife too. They slithered off into obscurity, perhaps the kindest ending in that entire family history. But not all cursed families were royal. Some were simply too beautiful for their own good. Take the tale of Phaedra, wife of Theseus. Her stepson Hippolytus was a devout follower of Artemis, so devout in fact, that he shunned all love and scorned Aphrodite. And you can imagine how well that went. Aphrodite, goddess of love and vengeance, arranged for Phaedra to fall in love with him. An impossible, shameful desire. She fought it, hid it, but eventually confessed. And when he rejected her, she took her own life, leaving a note claiming he had attacked her. Theseus cursed his son, and Poseidon, never one to pass up a smiting, obliged. Hippolytus died, dashed against the rocks by his own chariot horses. You could die because your family was cursed, or because a god wanted revenge on someone you reminded them of, or simply because you existed in the orbit of doomed people. Misery was contagious. The Greeks didn't believe in fairness, not in the modern sense. They believed in Moira, one's share, one's portion of fate. Some were given great glory, others were given ruin, sometimes both. But what about redemption, you might ask? What about mortals who escaped the curse? They're rare but not impossible. Orestes, hounded by the Furies, eventually received a trial in Athens. The jury was split, half for acquittal, half for condemnation. Athena herself cast the deciding vote, not in the name of justice but mercy, and in that moment a new idea emerged. That law might one day replace vengeance, that perhaps a man need not be defined solely by his ancestors' crimes. It was a glimmer of hope, a small one, but there it was. In the meantime, the average mortal lived quietly, married carefully, prayed constantly. One eye on the gods, one foot in the dirt, hoping the sins of the father had not already taken root in the son. To be a mortal in Greek mythology was to live in a story that began long before you were born and might not end until long after you were gone. Your life was a single verse in a tragic poem, shaped by bloodlines, curses, and the unpredictable whims of fate. You might rise, you might fall, but you would not escape the weight of your name. And if the gods whispered your family's name in Olympus, whether in praise or in jest, that was rarely a good sign. There are many lessons to learn from Greek mythology, but one stands above the rest, carved like a warning into the very foundations of Mount Olympus. Do not talk back to the gods. Don't question them, don't correct them, don't get clever, sarcastic, or poetic. Don't mutter under your breath, don't sigh too loudly, and above all, do not under any circumstances try to win an argument. Because they will hear you, they always do, and while gods may be immortal, their egos are surprisingly brittle. Take the case of Pentheus, king of Thebes, young, proud, fond of order. He ruled with a sharp eye and a firm hand, and then Dionysus arrived. Now Dionysus was not your typical Olympian. Born of a mortal mother, Semele, and carried in Zeus's thigh, he straddled the line between divine and human, wild and civilized, wine and wrath. His worship was strange, ecstatic, dancing in the woods, drinking, shouting, shedding inhibition like a snake skin. Pentheus, unimpressed, declared it nonsense. He banned Dionysian rites, arrested the god in disguise, mocked his long hair, and in the sort of fatal decision only a tragic character could make, decided to spy on the Bacchic women in their revels, dressed as one of them. He crept into the forest in a flowing gown, perched in a tree for a better view. And there, in the moonlight, the women saw him. But they did not see a man, Dionysus clouded their minds. They saw a lion. They had dagged. His own mother, Agave, was first to reach him. She tore him down. He died in pieces, smiling up at the stars. The gods are nothing if not theatrical. Pentheus's crime, he laughed, he doubted. He told the gods they were nonsense. And the gods, it turns out, have a very clear opinion on nonsense. Another fellow who learned this the hard way was Capaneus, a warrior in the myth of the Seven against Thebes. He scaled the city walls, bold as brass, and declared aloud in the middle of battle that not even Zeus could stop him. Zeus did stop him. With a lightning bolt, instant death crisped mid-sentence. There's a curious silence that follows stories like these, a kind of collective holding of breath, because the moral is never subtle. Speak out of turn, and you will be turned to ash or stone or mist or a cautionary statue in some temple courtyard. Even those who told the truth, not lies but inconvenient truths, were punished. Cassandra, princess of Troy, was given the gift of prophecy by Apollo. But when she rejected his advances, or rather accepted the gift and then rejected him, he cursed her. She would still see the future, yes, she would see it clearly, brilliantly, unbearably, but no one would ever believe her. She warned of the Trojan horse, of the sack of the city, of her own death, and every word fell like dust, disbelieved, ignored, dismissed. The gods, you see, don't mind if you're right as long as it's flattering. If it's not, well, you'll find yourself yelling into the void, and sometimes the punishment came not from the god directly, but through the very forces of fate itself. Take Arachne, you'll remember her from earlier, the weaver who dared claim she was better than Athena. The detail often overlooked in her story is this: she was right. Her tapestry was beautiful, it told the truth. It depicted the gods' crimes, their disguises, their seductions. And Athena, though furious, could not deny the skill. So she destroyed the work and the girl, because it is not enough to be right, you must also be reverent. And in ancient Greece, reverence did not mean quiet belief, it meant submission. It's easy to judge the gods as petty, and to be fair, they often were. But their responses reflect something deeper about the way the Greeks saw the world. The gods were not moral exemplars. They were not just or fair in the way we use those terms now. They were powerful, and that in the ancient world was the only justice that mattered. Power could not be questioned without consequence. The gods represented not ideals but forces. The sea was Poseidon, stormy, unpredictable, capable of bounty or destruction. Wisdom was Athena, cold, strategic, sometimes cruel. Love was Aphrodite, capricious, overwhelming, delightfully irrational. To insult a god was to insult the very fabric of the world. To question Artemis was to court death in childbirth. To laugh at Demeter was to risk famine, and the gods did not need to punish you personally. Sometimes they let your own words do the damage. Consider Niobe again, the queen who bragged about her many children, mocking Leto for having only 2. It was not just pride, it was speech. She voiced disrespect, she put it into the world, and so Leto's children, Apollo and Artemis, struck her family down, one by one. When the last child died, Niobe fled to a mountaintop and begged the gods to end her suffering. They granted her request, turned her to stone. Even her tears, they say, became part of the mountain, always weeping, never changing. It's tempting to imagine these stories as metaphors, cautionary tales for courtly behavior. But in ancient Greece they were lived truths, not literal perhaps, but deeply embedded in ritual and thought. People didn't just fear the gods, they feared saying the wrong thing near a shrine, making a joke during a sacrifice, yawning too loudly during a festival. Speech was power, and power could summon attention. And attention, divine attention, was rarely a blessing. The Greek term for this was asabeia, impiety. It didn't mean heresy in the modern sense, it meant acting improperly toward the divine, speaking out of turn, behaving without the right reverence. Socrates the philosopher was executed not for atheism, but for asabeia, corrupting the youth, introducing new gods and failing to honor the old ones. The gods did not require you to love them, but they demanded respect. The curious thing is, the gods themselves rarely held to the same standard. Zeus was a serial adulterer. Hera was vengeful beyond reason. Poseidon flooded cities in fits of pique. Apollo flayed a man alive for losing a music contest, and yet to question their actions was to invite ruin. It was a divine paradox. You were expected to worship beings whose flaws were legendary, and you had to do it with sincerity. And so the average mortal developed a very pragmatic relationship with religion. You honored the gods because it was safer that way. You made offerings, said your prayers, did not boast, did not challenge. And if the gods smiled on you, wonderful. And if they didn't, you assumed you'd offended them somehow and tried harder. There's a quiet desperation in that, a sort of cosmic appeasement. A reminder that in a world ruled by immortals with bad tempers, the only real power mortals had was silence. Which brings us to another kind of punishment. Not dramatic, not fiery, not sudden, but slow, oblivion. The Greeks believed in kleos, glory, the kind that lives on in stories. But if you defied the gods in some quiet, unseen way, you might not be struck down, you might simply be forgotten. No songs, no statues, no name carved into stone. To be remembered was its own kind of immortality. To be erased was the cruelest fate of all. That perhaps is why so many Greek mortals died dramatically. They weren't just unlucky, they were memorable. To live quietly was safe, but it meant no glory, no legacy, and so mortals danced along a razor's edge, seeking renown but fearing offense, wanting to be known but not cursed, wanting most of all to speak their truth without being struck by lightning. But the gods were always listening, even when they pretended not to be, especially then. And so, dear listener, if you ever find yourself wandering the paths of ancient Greece under a fig tree or beside a bubbling spring, and you feel tempted to complain aloud about your lot in life, perhaps wait until you're well out of earshot, because one of them might be listening and one of them might be bored. And mortals who talk back tend not to talk long. You're walking along a dusty road. There's a cool breeze, the scent of thyme and olive in the air, and the sound of distant goats. All is calm, all is ordinary. And then, suddenly, a creature the size of a house steps out from behind a rock and decides you look like lunch. Welcome to a fairly typical Tuesday in ancient Greek mythology. For mortals, the world was never just fields and sky. It was also layers. Caves, cliffs, forests thick with teeth and scales. You never quite knew what might be lurking behind the next olive tree. A shepherd, a satyr, or a three-headed dog. The Greeks were particularly fond of monsters, not in the way modern stories might treat them. Misunderstood, sympathetic, tragic. No, their monsters were generally speaking quite content being horrible. They didn't need complex motivations, they just needed appetites. And unfortunately, mortals were often the preferred dish. Let us begin with one of the greats, the chimera, not just one beast but 3. A lion in the front, a goat sprouting from its back, and a snake for a tail. It breathed fire, of course, because why not? Its purpose in life appeared to be to roam the countryside burning livestock and incinerating anyone with a torch and a sword who thought they might make a name for themselves. Heroic, yes, but also flammable. Then there's Scylla, poor sailors. They thought the worst part of their journey was the open sea, the storms, the pirates, the hunger. But then they reached the straits, narrow and perilous. On one side a whirlpool named Charybdis, which could suck down entire ships like a drunkard draining a wineskin. And on the other, Scylla, a rock-dwelling horror with 12 legs, 6 heads, and a fondness for plucking sailors off decks like hors d'oeuvres. There was no safe route. If you steered away from one, you veered too close to the other. And in life, as in myth, some choices are not about winning. They're about minimizing how much of your crew you lose. Or take the Minotaur, half man, half bull, raised in a labyrinth so complex that even its builder barely escaped. This monster was the result of a long and unfortunate chain of divine meddling and royal bad judgment. A queen enchanted to fall in love with a bull, an architect with too much imagination, and a child born of that union, imprisoned forever in darkness. The Athenians, having displeased King Minos of Crete, were forced to send 7 young men and 7 maidens every 9 years as tribute to be released into the labyrinth. None returned, until of course Theseus came along with his ball of string and healthy levels of self-confidence. But for decades before that, the Minotaur simply ate. That was the thing about monsters in Greek mythology. They weren't just dangers, they were reminders, symbols, warnings. Perhaps that the world wasn't made for human comfort, that out there in the deep places the gods had let chaos roam free. And mortals were often the price paid for order. The Sphinx perched outside Thebes was another such price. She asked riddles. If you answered incorrectly, she killed you. For weeks, months, perhaps even years, travelers passed, tried, failed, died, until Oedipus, clever, doomed Oedipus, came along and answered her question correctly. The Sphinx leaped from her perch and perished, which sounds like a victory, until you remember that this was only the beginning of Oedipus' troubles. Solving one monster's riddle only led him deeper into the riddle of his own blood. These creatures weren't all created equal either. Some were born of primordial forces like Typhon, a storm demon so massive and terrible that the gods themselves fled Olympus when he rose. Others were spawned by Echidna, the mother of all monsters, who seemed to have a very productive relationship with Typhon, birthing Hydra, Cerberus, and a host of other delightful creatures best admired from a distance. Hydra, for instance, was a serpent with multiple heads. When you cut one off, 2 more grew in its place. A handy metaphor, really, for problems that get worse the more you meddle. Or, in the case of Heracles, just another day's work. Heracles, the closest thing Greek mythology has to a full-time monster exterminator, spent his life dealing with the gods' unfinished business. Giant boars, man-eating birds, hellhounds, all sent his way, usually as part of a labor assigned by a cowardly king or an angry god. One gets the sense that the Olympians didn't like cleaning up their messes. They just created monsters, then waited for some sweaty mortal with a club to solve the problem. And when he did, they might grant him a wreath, or more likely send him another one. Even beautiful creatures could be deadly. The sirens, for instance, sat on craggy rocks by the sea, singing songs so sweet that sailors forgot themselves, forgot food, sleep, wives, children, everything. They steered toward the sound, dashed their ships on the rocks, and died smiling. Odysseus, clever man that he was, stuffed his crew's ears with wax and tied himself to the mast, just to hear their song without being lured. A rare case of a man encountering a monster and surviving with his life and ego intact. More often, mortals stumbled upon danger with no warning. A flash of feathers, a shadow in the sky, a hiss from a cave. The ancient Greek countryside, in myth, was riddled with hazards, not just beasts but divine punishments given form, and yet despite all this, monsters were necessary. They gave heroes something to fight. They shaped stories into arcs from fear to confrontation to, sometimes, triumph. But for the ordinary mortal, the non-hero, the farmer or fisher or child caught in the crossfire, they were simply a reminder that the world was not safe. Imagine living in a time where no explanation existed for earthquakes or droughts, where disease had no clear cause, where lightning struck without warning. The world must have seemed full of unseen forces, and so the Greeks filled that uncertainty with teeth and wings and claws. But monsters were not just symbols of nature. They were also warnings about behavior. Take Medusa. She began in some versions as a beautiful maiden, but after Poseidon assaulted her in Athena's temple, the goddess punished her, not Poseidon, by turning her into a gorgon. Snake hair, petrifying gaze, solitude eternal. What was she really? A monster or a woman transformed by divine wrath into something others should fear, perhaps both? The Greeks understood that monsters were not just born. They were made. Often they were mortals first, changed by curses, by jealousy, by vengeance. The line between human and beast was always thin. Lycaon, for example, was a king who served Zeus human flesh disguised as hospitality. In return, he was turned into a wolf, an early werewolf tale. If you like, but also a message. Offend the gods and you might lose more than your manners. Even lovers of gods could become monsters. Take Lamia, once a queen of Libya, beloved by Zeus. Hera naturally took offense. As punishment, Lamia's children were slain. Grief drove her mad. Hera then added a cruel twist. Lamia was cursed never to sleep and to devour the children of others. She became a night-stalking demon, feared in lullabies. But beneath the horror was sorrow. Her monstrousness was not her fault. It was her sentence. In this way, monsters in Greek myth were often tragic, not in a soft modern sense but in the hard classical sense of the word. They suffered, they frightened, they died, but they were never senseless. They meant something. Even Cerberus, the three-headed hound of Hades, had his purpose. He stood at the gates of the underworld, let souls in, did not let them out. A monster, yes, but also a guardian, a cosmic border collie of sorts, and so mortals lived with monsters, not just in story but in worldview. They were the teeth in the darkness, the consequences of divine will or human folly, or simply the old world not yet tamed. No mortal could kill them all, no city could be safe forever. But they endured. They built temples to gods who might keep monsters away. They passed down tales of how to defeat them, how to avoid them, how to live with the knowledge that they might always be nearby. For some, monsters were an invitation, a chance to rise, to become a hero, to carve their name in the annals of myth. For others, they were just bad luck, a wrong turn, a scream in the night. And for most, they were simply a reminder that the world was not made for their comfort. It was a place of beauty, yes, but also of wings in the sky, scales beneath the waves, eyes in the dark. And when the gods were bored or careless or cruel, they let the monsters roam free. There's a strange thing about Greek heroes. They shine like stars in poetry, cast in bronze, immortalized in epic. Their names echo through the centuries: Achilles, Heracles, Jason, Odysseus. But if you pause a moment and really look at their stories, not the glory but the lives themselves, you might begin to wonder, was it worth it? Because to be a hero in Greek mythology was to be famous, yes, but also to be hunted, cursed, betrayed, punished, exiled, tormented by the gods, and without fail to die tragically. You were heroic, but you were disposable. Let's begin with the most obvious case. Achilles, the poster boy of Greek heroism, stronger than all, faster than most, and blessed or cursed with a choice. Live a long, quiet life in obscurity, or die young and gain eternal glory. Naturally, he chose the latter. This is Greek myth, after all. Longevity was never fashionable. So he sailed for Troy, fought for 10 long years, killed Hector, dragged his body around the city walls, and then one morning was struck down by a single arrow, guided by Apollo, fired by Paris, and aimed at the one soft place on his body, the heel. It's poetic, of course, but also rather deflating. All that strength, all that wrath, and in the end, one tiny vulnerability was enough. Because heroes were never allowed to simply age, they didn't retire, they didn't settle down and write memoirs, they didn't even get to enjoy their triumphs. They existed to die at the right moment, in the right way, for the right song to be sung, and the gods made sure of it. Heracles, or Hercules if you prefer the Latin form, is another fine example. A man so strong he held up the sky, cleaned the stables of Augeas in a single afternoon, and strangled snakes in his cradle. But for all his power, he was never free. The 12 labors, those famous feats, were not optional. They were penance. You see, in a fit of madness sent by Hera, Heracles killed his wife and children. The punishment? Service, labor, tasks so monstrous they might as well have been death sentences. And even after completing them, he didn't get peace. His life ended in agony, poisoned by a tunic soaked in centaur blood. A gift from his second wife, who had been tricked into thinking it would ensure his fidelity. He died on a pyre, flames consuming the mortal half of him, the divine half ascending to Olympus. Yes, the gods welcomed him in the end, but only after they had burned him down to his bones. Then there's Jason, handsome, charming, ambitious Jason. He assembled the finest team in mythology, the Argonauts, and sailed off to win the Golden Fleece. It was a dazzling journey. Monsters, clashing rocks, enchanted lands, and of course, Medea, the brilliant, terrifying sorceress who helped him succeed, killed for him, betrayed her family for him. And what did he do when they returned? He married another woman. Medea responded as Medea does, by murdering their children and leaving him broken and alone. Jason, once so glorious, died years later when a beam from his rotting ship fell and crushed him. A hero forgotten, killed not by war or wrath but by neglect and gravity. These men, lion-hearted, battle-scarred, were never truly safe, not from monsters, nor from their friends, nor even from their own choices. Their greatness didn't protect them. In fact, it often attracted the worst. The gods were quick to take offense at mortals who gained too much glory. After all, divine attention was rarely a compliment. Ask Bellerophon. He was a proper hero. tamer of Pegasus, slayer of the Chimera, a man favored by the gods, and then one day he decided to fly Pegasus up to Olympus, not to conquer, just to visit. It did not go well. Zeus sent a gadfly to sting the horse. Bellerophon fell, survived, technically, but was crippled, blind, and lived out his days wandering alone, hated by gods and men alike. Because the one thing a mortal must never do is try to sit at the table of the divine. That's not to say heroism wasn't admired. The Greeks celebrated it in song and sculpture, but there was always a sense of danger about it, a sense that to rise too high was to invite the fall. And nowhere is that clearer than in the story of Ajax, a giant among men, a warrior of unmatched strength and courage. After Achilles' death, his armor was to be awarded to the next greatest Greek. Ajax expected it. Odysseus received it. Humiliated, maddened, Ajax plotted revenge. But Athena clouded his mind. He slaughtered livestock, thinking they were his comrades. When he came to his senses, grief-stricken and dishonored, he fell on his own sword. No enemy defeated him, only shame. It's important to understand how the Greeks viewed glory, kleos as they called it. It was not just fame, it was the legacy of your deeds, what would be remembered after you were gone, what poets would sing, what statues would show. And because the afterlife was, frankly, rather dismal, gray fields, wandering shades, no wine to speak of, kleos was the only immortality that mattered. To be forgotten was worse than death, and so heroes chased danger, risked everything. They weren't reckless because they were foolish. They were desperate, for meaning, for memory, for a life that would echo. And yet there's a quiet sadness to it all. Odysseus, for instance, won the war at Troy through cunning. The Trojan horse was his idea, and after the war he spent 10 years trying to get home, battling storms, monsters, temptations, all because he had once boasted that his triumphs were his own. And Poseidon took that very personally. Even when he reached Ithaca at last, his troubles weren't over. He had to slaughter a house full of suitors, rebuild trust with his wife, reassert his kingship. It was never over, not really. Because in Greek myth, the hero never gets to rest, and when they do, it often means they're dead. Even the great Perseus, who slew Medusa and rescued Andromeda, ends not in triumph, but in obscurity. His victories made him famous, yes, but he fades from the story, settles down, vanishes from the epic stage. Glory, it seems, has an expiration date. The women of mythology, too, had their share of heroic suffering. Though less often sung by bards, their stories are no less seared by pain. Atalanta, for example, swiftest of runners, deadliest of hunters, she swore never to marry unless beaten in a foot race. Many tried, all failed, until one man, Hippomenes, used golden apples from Aphrodite to distract her. He won, they married, and then, caught in a moment of passion, they made love in a sacred temple. The gods, of course, were not amused. They were turned into lions, forever circling, never resting. So many Greek heroes ended up transformed, not exalted, but altered, humbled, made into animals or stars or flowers, their stories twisted by divine hands into reminders for the rest of us. Be brave, yes, but not too brave. Be famous, yes, but not too proud. Live brightly, but do not outshine the gods. Even those who served the gods directly could not count on safety. Asclepius, son of Apollo, became so skilled in healing that he learned to raise the dead. A noble calling, perhaps, but one that annoyed Hades. Death, after all, was part of the cosmic order. So Zeus killed him with a thunderbolt. Apollo retaliated by killing the Cyclops who made the bolt. In turn, Zeus banished Apollo to serve as a mortal shepherd. A cascade of punishment. Even the divine could be demoted, the heroic undone. And yet, despite all this, the danger, the madness, the inevitable fall, mortals still aspired to be heroes. They volunteered for quests, they prayed for signs, they followed omens into forests full of fangs and fire. Because obscurity was worse. Cowardice unthinkable, a quiet life almost shameful. The Greeks didn't want safe stories, they wanted ones worth telling, and so, over and over, mortals gave themselves to the gods and the monsters and the wars and the wounds, not for peace but for song. The bards remembered them, we remember them. They were chewed up by myth, yes, but they were not forgotten. They were heroic, and they were disposable. But perhaps, just perhaps, they knew that going in. Love, they say, makes the world go round. But in Greek mythology it more often sends it spinning wildly off course than straight into a ditch. Because in the world of gods and mortals, love wasn't the soft rose-petaled notion we like to imagine today. It was far more treacherous, a force of nature, or worse, a divine weapon. It could bless, yes, but more often it ruined. And for mortals, falling in love, or worse, being loved by a god, was one of the most dangerous things that could possibly happen. Let's begin with a cautionary tale. One of the most beautiful, Pygmalion, a sculptor from Cyprus, gifted and solitary. He carved a statue of a woman, not just beautiful but perfect. so perfect in fact, that he fell in love with her, whispered to her, brought her gifts, dressed her in fine robes. A little odd perhaps, but harmless enough. Then he went to the temple of Aphrodite and asked, gently, reverently, for a bride like the statue. The goddess, amused or perhaps flattered, answered. The statue came to life. A happy ending, one might think. But look closer, Pygmalion didn't fall in love with a woman, he created one. She had no past, no family, no memories. She existed only to please him. The Greeks didn't bother to give her a name until Roman poets did, centuries later. Love in this case was not a relationship, it was possession dressed in poetry. But far more often, love in myth wasn't about creation, it was about punishment. Take Narcissus, a young man so stunning that people fell in love with him on sight. But he showed no interest, no affection, no kindness. One rejected soul prayed to the gods for vengeance, and they delivered it. Narcissus came to a still pool, saw his own reflection, fell in love, unable to touch the image, unable to look away. He withered, died, and where he fell a flower grew, delicate, pale, always bowing toward the water. The Greeks knew what we now call toxic self-regard, but they turned it into a myth, a warning softly blooming by the riverbank. Then there's poor Echo, a nymph who talked too much. By some accounts she used to distract Hera while Zeus conducted his usual affairs. When Hera discovered the trick, she cursed Echo so she could only repeat what others said. She met Narcissus, loved him silently, helplessly, repeated his words back to him like a plea. And when he spurned her, she faded. Only her voice remained. Love in Greek mythology was not a gentle bond between equals, it was more often a trap. Consider Orpheus and Eurydice, a poet, a lyre player. A man whose music could charm birds from trees and tears from stone. When Eurydice died bitten by a serpent on their wedding day, Orpheus did what no mortal had dared. He went to the underworld to fetch her back. He played, he pleaded, and for once the gods listened. They let her go on one condition. He must not look back at her until they reached the upper world. He agreed, walked ahead, listened to her footsteps behind, but doubt crept in. What if she wasn't there? What if they tricked him? He turned. And in that instant Eurydice was gone again. This time forever. He lived on, played on, until in one version he was torn apart by Maenads, wild women of Dionysus, because he would no longer love anyone but his lost bride. Even when the love was mutual, the story rarely ended well. Take Phaedra and Hippolytus. He was handsome, chaste, devoted to Artemis, the goddess of the hunt and of purity. His stepmother, Phaedra, was cursed by Aphrodite to fall in love with him. An impossible, shameful desire. She fought it, hid it, but eventually confessed. And when he rejected her, she took her own life, leaving a note claiming he had assaulted her. Theseus, his father, cursed him. Poseidon, never one to pass up a smiting, obliged. Hippolytus died, dragged by his chariot horses along the rocks. Aphrodite and Artemis, the goddesses who stood behind the drama, ended the tale by mourning their respective champions. Love once again proved fatal. And of course, there's the story of Paris and Helen. He was a Trojan prince, she the most beautiful woman in the world, and very much married. Paris awarded a golden apple to Aphrodite in a divine beauty contest, and she gave him Helen in return. It was not a gentle elopement, it was an abduction or perhaps a seduction depending on which version you read. But either way, it was enough to launch 1,000 ships. The Trojan War followed. 10 years of slaughter, cities burned, heroes died, all for one woman and one ill-advised divine bribe. To love in myth was to gamble to be loved, even more so, especially if the lover was a god. Zeus, of course, was the most infamous. He appeared to mortals as a bull, a swan, a shower of gold, an eagle, a cloud. Romantic, perhaps, if you ignore the implications. His lovers suffered. Semele was incinerated. Io was turned into a cow, later bore children who hatched from eggs. Europa was carried across the sea. Danae conceived Perseus in a locked chamber. And Callisto, after being seduced or assaulted depending on the version, was turned into a bear. Her son nearly killed her. The gods finally placed them in the stars, Ursa Major and Minor, a consolation prize if ever there was one. Aphrodite herself was no gentler. When she fell in love with the mortal Anchises, she warned him not to tell anyone. He did, bragged about it, and was struck by lightning, or made lame or blinded. The myths vary, but the moral does not. Even being loved by a goddess could ruin you. There's a strange logic to all of this. Love in the Greek imagination wasn't controllable. It wasn't rational. It was divine madness. Eros, not the soft affection of modern romance, but a kind of possession. When you were in love, you were no longer yourself. And that, in a society that prized moderation, dignity, and restraint, was deeply unsettling. The god Eros, or Cupid as the Romans later called him, was not a cherub. He was a force, a spark of chaos. To be struck by his arrows was to lose your will, your reason, your control, and mortals, bound as they were by duty and fate, could not afford to lose control. Even in history, this theme persisted. The Greeks saw love as something that could be both civilizing and destructive. Marriage was a social contract, important, yes, sacred even. But passion, eros, was dangerous, powerful, not to be trusted. In their dramas, love leads to downfall. In their temples, it's a force to be worshipped carefully. And in their myths, it is almost always tragic. Psyche, a mortal princess, was so beautiful that people stopped worshipping Aphrodite. The goddess, furious, sent Eros to make her fall in love with a monster. But Eros fell in love with her himself. He visited her at night in darkness, never revealing his face. She was forbidden to look, of course, she did. He fled. She wandered the earth, performing impossible tasks to win him back. Eventually, they were reunited. She was made immortal. One of the rare happy endings, but only after a great deal of divine humiliation, grief, and symbolic death. So why, one might ask, did the Greeks keep telling these stories? Because love to them was never safe, but it was always real. It was the crack in the armor, the madness in the king, the pull between mortal and divine. They feared it, revered it, wrapped it in myth so they might understand it, or at least contain it. And perhaps that's why love remains so compelling in their stories. Not because it leads to joy, but because it leads somewhere. Downward, inward, forward, into ruin, into glory, into madness. For the mortal caught in the grip of love, there was no map, no safe path, only the hope that the gods would look away just this once. But they rarely did, because for them, love was a tool, a game. And for mortals it was a trap. You'd think that after everything, the curses, the monsters, the heartbreak, and the gods with personal vendettas, that mortals in Greek mythology might be rewarded with something a little gentler after death. A nice rest, a sun-dappled meadow, perhaps a reunion with loved ones and a bit of harp music in the background. But no, because in Greek mythology, death wasn't the end of suffering. It was the beginning of something far more bureaucratic. The afterlife was not heaven. It was not hell. It was mostly gray. And if you were a mortal, even a decent one, the best you could usually hope for after dying was to become a mildly confused shade, wandering aimlessly across a dull plain for eternity without sunlight, identity, or purpose. Welcome to the Asphodel Meadows. This was the Greek default. Not a place of torture, not exactly. But neither was it comforting. It was bland, unchanging, a sort of cosmic waiting room where the dead drifted about like leaves in a windless forest, remembering less and less as the centuries rolled by. You weren't punished. You simply were. And if that sounds bleak, well, it was. But let's back up a little. Let's talk logistics. When a person died, their soul, the psyche, separated from the body and made its way to the underworld, guided by Hermes, who handled, among other things, the delivery of souls. One imagines him like a sort of mythological courier, stylish and swift, if perhaps a bit impersonal. The soul would arrive at the banks of the river Styx, where Charon, the grim-faced ferryman, awaited with his boat. Payment was expected, usually an obol, a coin placed under the tongue or on the eyes of the deceased at burial. Those without proper burial or without the coin were doomed to wander the shore for 100 years, voiceless and unable to cross. A chilling thought, really. The journey to the afterlife could be delayed simply by a careless undertaker. Once ferried across the river, assuming everything went smoothly, the soul would enter the realm of Hades, not the god himself, though he was there too, in a distant shadowy palace, but the place, the underworld, guarded by Cerberus, the three-headed hound who let you in but most certainly not out. And here your fate was decided, but not by gods, not usually. The Greek afterlife had a staff, 3 judges, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus, mortals once but now the eternal arbiters of the dead. They examined your life, your deeds, your crimes, your sacrifices, and based on this celestial audit you were sorted, if you were truly vile, a betrayer, a murderer, a blasphemer of extraordinary talent, you might be sent to Tartarus, not just a deep pit but the pit, a vast abyss of torment, located even below Hades itself. Here, the worst offenders endured punishments designed not just for pain, but for poetic symmetry. Tantalus, who murdered his own son and served him to the gods, was made to stand forever in a pool of water beneath a fruit tree. But whenever he reached for the fruit or bent to drink, they slipped just out of reach. He was forever hungry, forever thirsty, forever tantalized. Sisyphus, who cheated death twice, once by tricking Thanatos, the spirit of death, and once by convincing his wife not to bury him, was condemned to roll a boulder uphill for all eternity. Each time it neared the summit, it rolled back down. The punishment wasn't just hard labor, it was the futility of effort, the endless repetition of hope undone. Then there was Ixion. He tried to seduce Hera, not a wise move. Zeus bound him to a flaming wheel that spins without end, an eternal reminder that some mortal ambitions were simply not worth the risk. But here's the thing. These were rare fates. Tartarus was not overcrowded. Most souls were not evil enough for torment, nor good enough for reward. Which brings us back to the Asphodel Meadows, the realm of the ordinary dead. The decent, the forgettable, the ones who paid their taxes, said their prayers, and didn't cause too much trouble. They simply drifted, and as the centuries passed, they forgot who they were, forgotten by the living, unremarkable among the dead. They faded, not erased. The Greeks didn't believe in annihilation, but reduced, diminished, present but without sharpness. It wasn't punishment, it was entropy. But not all souls ended there. A fortunate few, heroes, the exceptionally just, or those favored by the gods, were granted entry into the Elysian fields. Now this finally was something approaching reward. A land of endless spring, gentle breezes, music, feasts, athletic contests if you fancied a bit of running after death. The elite of the afterlife. Achilles was there, though in Homer's telling he wasn't exactly thrilled about it. When Odysseus visits the underworld and speaks to Achilles, the great warrior says he would rather be a living servant to a poor man than a king among the dead, which rather dampens the appeal. Still, the Elysian fields offered peace, if not pleasure. And if you lived particularly well, or were reincarnated and lived well again, you might be allowed to stay there forever. A sort of celestial retirement plan for the morally consistent. The Greeks did, in time, entertain the idea of reincarnation. Plato, ever the philosopher, wrote of souls being judged, then choosing their next life based on the lessons learned. A philosopher might become a king, a tyrant, perhaps a dung beetle. Your fate in this telling was shaped by what you valued. Wisdom led to clarity, vanity led to repetition. It was not universal belief, more a philosophical add-on. But it showed that even the Greeks longed for some sense of justice beyond the grave. Still, for most, the underworld remained what it always had been, a place of silence. There was no divine light, no reward for faith. The gods of Olympus lived forever, but mortals, even beloved mortals, sank into shadow. Even the heroes who visited the underworld, Odysseus, Aeneas, Orpheus, came away changed, haunted. It was not a place you left without consequence. And mortals who tried to cheat death, well, they rarely succeeded. Orpheus, as we've seen, looked back too soon. Persephone, stolen by Hades, ate 6 seeds of a pomegranate and was bound to return each year. Even Heracles, who went to fetch Cerberus as one of his labors, barely escaped unscathed. Death in Greek thought was not evil, it was inevitable, unavoidable. It did not judge or weep or rage, it simply came. Thanatos, the spirit of death, was not cruel. He was quiet, pale-winged. He did not chase, he arrived. And when he did, your story ended, or rather it continued just without plot. The funeral rituals reflected this view. The Greeks took burial seriously. It wasn't about grief alone. It was necessity. To be unburied was to be trapped, restless, cut off. Even enemies were sometimes buried by their foes simply to ensure their souls wouldn't linger. And libations, offerings poured into the earth, were common. Wine, milk, honey, olive oil. Not because the dead could drink them, but because it kept the bond intact. The living honored the dead, and in doing so, reminded themselves that their own journey would someday lead below. So they prayed, sacrificed, built tombs, whispered names. Not out of fear, precisely, but out of duty. Because the afterlife, though quiet, was not entirely empty. A memory, in the Greek imagination, was the only thing that could truly outlive death. If no one remembered you, you faded. If they did, if they told your stories, visited your grave, spoke your name, you lingered. Dimly, softly, but still. And so the greatest fear was not fire or punishment, it was being forgotten. That's why heroes chased glory. Why poets wrote epics, why names were carved into stone. Because even if the gods ignored you, even if fate consumed you, perhaps someone, somewhere would remember. And in that memory you would remain, just a little longer. Imagine, if you will, living every moment of your life with the unsettling feeling that someone is watching you. Not just someone, dozens of someones, from the sky, the sea, the forest, the hearth, the sun, the shadows. Some are interested in your offerings, some are interested in your mistakes. And all of them have opinions. That was the world of a mortal in ancient Greece. The gods weren't distant. They didn't reside in some heavenly realm beyond the clouds, emerging only for cosmic events. No, they were everywhere. In every flame, breeze, groan of timber, rustle of olive leaf. They were always watching. And more troubling still, they were judging. They noticed everything, what you offered, what you said, what you didn't say, whether you were clean, whether you were honest, whether you looked the wrong direction during a festival or sneezed at the wrong moment in a temple. They watched you because you mattered, and also because you didn't. The gods, after all, had a tendency to fixate on mortals the way children fixate on ants. Fascinated, occasionally kind, often cruel. Even if you weren't a hero or a villain, even if you were just a simple fisherman or potter or widow selling figs at the market, you still lived under their gaze, and that meant you were always one missed prayer away from misfortune. Take Aictian, a perfectly decent young man, a hunter, a man fond of dogs and the quiet of the woods. One day, while wandering in the forest, he happened to stumble upon a glade. A soft breeze moved through the trees, birds chirped, and there, bathing in a secluded pool, was Artemis, goddess of the hunt, the moon, and fiercely guarded chastity. He did not speak, he did not stare, he simply saw her. That was enough. She turned her eyes, met his, and without a word she transformed him into a stag. His own dogs, loyal, sharp-toothed, and now very confused, tore him to pieces. The message was clear. Innocence was not a defense. The gods were watching, and they did not take kindly to being seen. Then there's the story of Baucis and Philemon, a rare, happy tale, but one with a sharp edge. Zeus and Hermes, disguised as poor travelers, wandered from door to door in a village, seeking shelter. House after house turned them away. Some mocked them. Some slammed the door. Only one cottage opened, a humble home shared by an elderly couple. They had little, but they gave freely, bread, olives, wine, and kindness. And so the gods, having revealed themselves, rewarded them. They turned the rude neighbors' homes to ash, flooded the village. Baucis and Philemon were spared, their cottage transformed into a temple. They were made priests, and when they died, they became two trees intertwined forever. It's a sweet story, but behind the blessing is a darker truth. The gods were testing you, secretly, constantly. And you never knew when it might be a beggar at your table, a stranger at the crossroads, a coin dropped on the road. Pass the test and you might be honored. Fail, and you might be turned into a tree or a statue or dust. There was no formal notice, no warning sign, no heavenly voice saying this is a test. You simply had to assume that the gods were watching and that they were not easily impressed. Hospitality, xenia as it was known, was sacred. To mistreat a guest was to insult Zeus himself, who was said to protect strangers and wanderers. But the same went for offerings, for sacrifices, for public festivals. Everything had to be done properly. The right words, the right steps, the right incense. And if it wasn't, well, perhaps the crops would fail, perhaps your ship would sink, perhaps your firstborn would cough once, then never again. There was no divine memo, no official notification that you'd offended a god. You had to piece it together. Was it Hera? Was it Apollo? Was it because you pulled the wine with your left hand? There's a kind of divine paranoia embedded in ancient Greek life. Not neurotic fear exactly, but a constant awareness that every action had meaning and every oversight might carry consequences. And with so many gods, Olympians, titans, river gods, tree spirits, household deities, nymphs of spring and stream, the chances of accidentally offending one were frankly rather high. Even saying a god's name in the wrong context could cause trouble. The poet Hesiod warned of speaking ill of the gods after dark. Night was sacred. Silence was better, safer. And yet silence too could be dangerous. Because what if the gods expected thanks or tribute or song? And so mortals lived in a kind of delicate balancing act. Speaking just enough, offering just enough, fearing just enough. Too much reverence, and you seemed insincere. Too little, and you'd seem ungrateful. It was a kind of cosmic etiquette. And the gods, like all finicky dinner guests, paid very close attention to manners. Then there were the temples, grand, beautiful spaces of marble and gold and flickering flame, but also homes, the gods' homes. And like any guest, you had to behave. You had to wash, to dress properly, to bring gifts, and above all, to mean it. Because the gods weren't just watching your actions, they were watching your heart. Piety was not a checklist, it was a posture of being, and mortals were expected to hold that posture forever. Even the festivals, which could be joyful, were serious business. The Dionysia, for example, with its theater and wine and revelry, wasn't just a party, it was a religious act. If you laughed too much at the wrong play or didn't laugh at all, it could be seen as an insult. Your enjoyment, your laughter, your participation, all part of the offering. Even at weddings and funerals, the gods were present, watching, judging. Did the bride offer properly to Hera? Was Hermes honored for guiding the dead? Were the laments sung loudly enough? Did the family remember to purify the house afterwards? Every detail mattered. Because in Greek mythology, the gods did not need your affection, but they demanded your respect. And they were always ready to correct you. Sometimes the judgment came quietly. A sudden illness, a failed harvest, a fishless season. Other times it came dramatically. A storm at sea, a madness in the family, a voice in the night. And once in a while it came with lightning. Because Zeus did love a good thunderbolt. Even historians of the time like Herodotus recorded events with divine judgment in mind. A king fell. Clearly he offended the gods, a city burned. Someone must have grown too proud. There was always a moral to the misfortune, always a finger pointing skyward. And so people told stories, remembered missteps, warned children, left small offerings on windowsills, whispered apologies to trees, sprinkled libations into the earth, just in case, because when the gods were angry they might destroy you. But when they were merely curious, that could be worse. Curiosity led to tests, to games, to strange dreams and stranger omens, to impossible choices with no right answer. And still, mortals played along. They told their myths, built their temples, painted their pots with stories of judgment and justice and divine caprice. Not because they loved their gods, but because they understood them. The gods were like storms, beautiful, unpredictable, necessary. And so long as you honored them, or at least tried to, perhaps they'd pass over your house without striking. But there were no guarantees, because the gods were watching, and they were always judging. There is a unique kind of cruelty in knowing your fate and being utterly powerless to change it. That, in essence, was the Greek prophecy. Not a warning to be avoided, not a guide to be followed, but a sentence spoken aloud. In mythology, prophecies weren't meant to help you. They were meant to trap you. They didn't just tell the future. They ensured it would happen. Even the act of trying to escape a prophecy was more often than not the very thing that fulfilled it. For mortals, this was particularly agonizing because the gods might tell you what was coming, but they would never, under any circumstance, explain how to survive it. Take, for example, the most famous case of all, Oedipus, a prince born in Thebes. A child prophesied to kill his father and marry his mother. His parents, understandably horrified, tried to kill him, a standard reaction in mythology. They pierced his ankles, tied him up, and left him on a mountain to die. But fate is rather good at navigating mountains. A shepherd found him, raised him far away in Corinth, unaware of his true origins, and one day, when Oedipus himself heard the prophecy, he did what seemed logical. He ran, fled Corinth, determined never to return, so he might avoid killing his father. On the road he quarreled with a stranger. The kind of heated, masculine misunderstanding one expects at a crossroads. He killed a man. Later he arrived in Thebes, saved the city from the Sphinx, married the queen, and slowly, terribly, the truth emerged. The man he'd killed, his real father. The queen, his mother. The prophecy had come true, not because he ignored it, but because he tried to stop it. That, you see, is how Greek prophecy works. It does not lie, but it never helps. It tells you what, never how, and certainly never why. On Olympus, Hercules was a strange fit. Most of the gods lounged, plotted, or occasionally meddled with mortals for sport. Hercules, however, was a man of action, a creature of motion. Even among immortals he was restless. He did not take easily to lounging on clouded thrones or sipping ambrosia while contemplating the nature of eternity. And so, unsurprisingly, he continued to intervene. There are stories of Hercules descending from Olympus to aid in battles. He appears to help heroes, to guide kings, to judge wrestling matches. His status was complicated. Not quite God, not quite ghost, not quite memory, but always there. In parts of Greece, especially in places like Thebes and Argos, Hercules was not just worshipped, he was invited. Shrines were built for him, sacrifices were made, and more unusually, rites were performed to call him down, to ask him to attend. These were not mere devotions, they were invitations for the god to return, to walk again among men, to protect them in moments of trial. One such rite, known as the Heraclea, was celebrated annually in many city-states. It commemorated his death, his burning, and his rebirth. Unlike most festivals for the gods, which emphasized their power and perfection, the Heraclea was about pain and triumph, about the long, scorched road to redemption. His cult grew, and with it, stories multiplied. Some claimed that Hercules now sat among the stars, his lion-skin cloak glittering in the firmament. Others said he walked the roads in disguise, helping travelers and punishing the wicked. And others still, especially the philosophers, began to see him not just as a figure of strength, but as a moral example. The Stoics, in particular, adored Hercules. To them, he was the embodiment of virtue, the Roman virtue of strength through discipline. Here was a man who had suffered, who had endured hardship after hardship, and who had chosen action over complaint, duty over despair. To live like Hercules was not to be invulnerable, but to be resilient. One philosopher, Musonius Rufus, once said that a man ought to strive for the same strength of character as Hercules, not the lifting of weights or slaying of beasts, but the courage to do what was necessary, even when one's soul trembled. In this way, Hercules became a bridge, not only between man and God, but between body and soul, between myth and philosophy. He became a kind of spiritual exercise, an ideal of suffering made meaningful by perseverance. The Romans, never ones to let a good god go to waste, adopted him wholeheartedly. They transformed Hercules into Hercules Victor, Hercules the Conqueror. A patron of soldiers, travelers, and merchants, temples were raised to him in Rome. Most notably the Round Temple in the Forum Boarium, where people came to pray for success in business and battle alike. Roman emperors adored the comparison. Commodus, that volatile and theatrical emperor, fancied himself a reincarnation of Hercules. He fought in the arena dressed in lion skins and had statues made in his image. It was, admittedly, not subtle. Others were more restrained. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, spoke often of endurance, and though he didn't claim descent from Hercules, the ideals he preached, calm, resolve, ethical action, echoed the Heraclean model in quieter tones. And so, over centuries, Hercules transformed again. He was a hero, then a god, then a symbol, a tale told to children, a prayer whispered by athletes, a statue softened by the rain. His strength remained, of course, always the club, the lion skin, the impossible biceps. But each strength began to mean something different. It wasn't just about violence or victory. It was about surviving, about the patience to carry burdens, the courage to atone, the strange grace of starting again. His image changed with the times. The early Hercules was wild-haired, wide-eyed, a man more beast than god. Later, in the Hellenistic age, he was shown older, heavier, more contemplative, still strong but now weary, a god who had known pain, a hero who had wept, and through all this his labors were never forgotten. Artists returned to them again and again, the lion, the hydra, the stables, the apples. Each one became a metaphor, challenges to be overcome, trials to be endured, personal monsters in mythic disguise. They were painted onto drinking cups, etched into stone, told over and over at dinner parties and temple gatherings and public games. Not because they were entertaining, though they certainly were, but because they held something timeless, a structure, a promise that if Hercules could do it, perhaps we could too, not slay monsters necessarily, but endure the things life throws at us, grief, doubt, fatigue, shame, and emerge still walking, still trying, still ourselves. By the time Christianity began to rise in the Mediterranean world, Hercules had already faded somewhat from daily worship. The temples grew quiet, the sacrifices stopped, but the memory remained, and in curious ways it was absorbed. The image of a suffering savior carrying burdens not his own, descending to the underworld and rising again. One needn't stretch too far to see the shadows he cast across later sacred narratives. Even today, he's still with us. In the gym, where men and women push their limits under posters of muscled heroes. In literature, where flawed protagonists strive for redemption. In philosophy, where we are reminded that virtue is not born in comfort but forged in fire. And in bedtime stories, where strength and sorrow dance side by side, Hercules, it seems, has never truly left. He simply changes shape, one day a statue, one day a star, one day a voice in your head telling you to get up and try again, even when everything aches. His labors are complete, but ours, in a gentler, quieter way, go on. So rest now, dear listener. You've carried enough for today. And tomorrow, well, tomorrow we face our own lions, but tonight you sleep. The name Hercules began as a whisper in the hills of ancient Greece, perhaps around a fire or beneath the columns of a small local shrine. But it did not stay there. It traveled like a pebble dropped into still water. The story of the strong man who suffered rippled outward. And as those ripples moved across time and territory, something remarkable happened. He changed. This chapter tells of Hercules not as a singular figure bound to a single myth, but as a traveler, a god without a border, a hero with many names. It is the story of how Hercules, born of Alcmene and Zeus, slayer of beasts and lifter of burdens, became something more, a universal symbol, a shape that each culture, empire, and age could mold into its own image, sometimes divine, sometimes absurd, always unforgettable. His journey begins, oddly enough, not in Greece, but from Greece. Through its colonies, trade routes, and ambitions, the early Greeks, even before Athens and Sparta became household names, were explorers. They set sail in small ships, hugging the coastlines, trading oil, wine, and stories. And wherever they went, they brought Hercules with them. In North Africa, for instance, Greek settlers brought the tale of Hercules to Egypt. The Egyptians already had a pantheon full to bursting, gods with falcon heads, crocodile jaws, and solar discs. But Hercules, with his club and lion skin, did not seem out of place. In fact, they found him somewhat familiar. He became associated with Harashaph, an older Egyptian deity, a creator god with ram's horns, worshipped at Heracleopolis. Yes, they renamed the city Heracleopolis Magna, the great city of Hercules. In this Egyptian form, Hercules lost none of his power, but he gained a touch of majesty. No longer the wild, brawling hero of Greece, he became a figure of wisdom, even kingship, a god of renewal and rulership. It is always fascinating to watch how cultures, when handed the same myth, choose to interpret it not by its original logic, but by their own need. In the East, among the Persians and later the Indians, the Greeks introduced him as part of their imperial storytelling. After Alexander the Great swept across the known world from Macedonia to the Indus River, he brought with him not only armies, but iconography, coins bearing the lion-headed visage of Hercules, temples with columns shaped like clubs. In India, some scholars believe Hercules may have influenced or been conflated with figures such as Vishnu or Krishna, particularly in the Greco-Buddhist kingdoms where Hellenic and Indian cultures overlapped. In Gandhara art, that haunting fusion of Greek realism and Buddhist serenity, we sometimes find figures who look suspiciously like Hercules, guarding stupas, standing beside bodhisattvas, lion skin slung casually across their shoulders. He had, it seems, become a guardian of thresholds. And then there is the West, the Roman West, where Hercules truly reached his second life. The Romans, practical and deeply fond of useful gods, renamed him Hercules, and made him a patron not just of strength, but of travelers, merchants, and military men. He was no longer a penitent figure trying to atone. He was a symbol of virtue, of active excellence, of triumph by effort. His club was less about violence now and more about steadfastness. Temples to Hercules appeared in Carthage, in Spain, in Gaul, and across Britannia. Roman soldiers carved his name into altars along Hadrian's Wall, even as far north as the Rhine and Danube. His story endured. A Mediterranean hero now clad in the midst of barbarian lands. He was not just a god, but a tool of empire. His labors became metaphors for imperial conquest. Just as Hercules had tamed the wild world in his myths, the boar, the lion, the stables, so too did Rome imagine itself taming the wilderness beyond its borders. But beneath the grandeur, Hercules still retained his complexity. Romans told jokes about him. They painted him in taverns, sometimes drunk, sometimes asleep, sometimes wrestling pigs instead of giants. He became, oddly enough, a figure of affection, more human than many of their distant, aloof gods. In Hispania, modern-day Spain and Portugal, Hercules was said to have founded Gades. The Pillars of Hercules, those two mythical rocks on either side of the Strait of Gibraltar, marked the edge of the known world. Non plus ultra, they said, nothing further beyond. A neat reminder that even the strongest man in legend had limits. And then, perhaps inevitably, Hercules passed into story as the Roman Empire waned. Christianity rose, and like many pagan figures, Hercules was gently repurposed, not entirely discarded, but no longer worshipped. In medieval texts he appeared not as a god, but as a cautionary tale, a strong man, yes, but one undone by pride or lust or wrath. The same traits that once made him heroic now made him tragic. Still, he would not disappear. In the Renaissance, that great rebirth of classical knowledge, Hercules came roaring back. Artists painted him with glowing skin, rippling muscles, eyes cast upward in stoic determination. Writers invoked him in Latin verse. Philosophers used him to argue for the nobility of struggle. Michelangelo sculpted him, Rubens painted him. In Florence he became a civic symbol, the strong man who defends the city from chaos. A very localized Hercules, you might say, complete with Florentine fashion and political nuance. In the 18th century, Enlightenment thinkers adopted him again, this time as a symbol of reason triumphing over superstition. The Hydra became ignorance, the stables became the corrupt institutions of church and state. The metaphor evolved, but the shape remained. And then, in the 20th century, something altogether different happened. Hercules went to Hollywood. He was played by bodybuilders, by Italians in sandals, by the occasional animated demigod with a singing satyr for a sidekick. He appeared in comics, in serials, in commercials, in gym names. His strength became a marketing tool, his labors a convenient plot device. And yet even there, beneath the muscle, the cheese, the fanfare, something of the old Hercules remained. He was still flawed, still funny, still in his way trying to do the right thing. He became whatever each era needed. A god in Egypt, a hero in Rome, a saintly sufferer in Byzantium, a cartoon in California. His adaptability is his power, not just his strength but his resonance, the way he fits into every age because he is, at heart, not just divine but recognizably human. A man who made mistakes, who lost his temper, who regretted things, who tried to fix them, who sometimes succeeded and sometimes didn't. In this way, Hercules has become not just a myth but a mirror. We see in him the best of us and at times the worst. We see the burdens we carry and the hope that we might one day put them down. We see the struggle, the exhaustion, the final rest. So when we say Hercules around the world, we are not merely mapping the places he touched. We are tracking the ways he continues to matter, in philosophy, in art, in quiet metaphors we don't always realize we're using. To call someone Herculean is to name them strong, yes, but also determined, dogged, capable of facing the thing no one else will face, and that perhaps is the truest legacy of all. Not the temples, not the films, not the myths carved in fading marble, but the idea that strength is not about being untouched by hardship, but about facing it anyway, quietly, relentlessly, kindly. So wherever you are tonight, be it under electric light or ancient stars, know that the man who once wrestled giants now waits gently in your story too. And maybe when things feel too heavy to lift, you'll remember him and try anyway. Rest now, listener. The world can wait. The next labor begins in the morning. Tonight you sleep.